Tonight, we begin with a legal move that U.S. officials, European policymakers, and international sanctions experts had feared, underestimated, and quietly tracked. A move that unfolded not over years of diplomacy, but in a single court session. A single court session that froze billions in enforcement actions. A single court session that forced Western governments to pause, reassess, and recalibrate. And a single court session that gave Moscow something it hasn't had in a long time: leverage. What Vladimir Putin allowed to proceed through Russia's legal system this week crossed a line that Western governments and international financial regulators had hoped would never matter. They believed sanctions were untouchable. They believed legal shields were airtight. They believed courts were secondary to economic power. But when that line broke, the West did not have a ready answer. Instead of tanks or missiles, Moscow responded with law, procedure, and timing. And by the time officials realized what had happened, the damage was already done. For nearly a year now, there had been signals, not press releases, not official speeches, just subtle legal indicators that Russia was preparing something unexpected. Not military, not cyber, but judicial. The Kremlin has been confrontational, yes, but it has also been methodical in how it builds counterpressure. Its moves have followed a certain pattern, a sequence, almost a checklist. First, challenge sanctions politically. Then, undermine them economically. Then, contest them legally. This third phase is the one many in the West underestimated. What set off alarm bells in Brussels, Washington, and London this time was not a dramatic announcement, it was silence. The legal noise stopped. Experts who monitor international sanctions compliance and cross-border litigation know the indicators. A sudden pause in Russian legal appeals abroad. The withdrawal of procedural challenges in European courts. The quiet consolidation of cases inside Russian jurisdiction, and the sudden reactivation of dormant commercial courts, all of that went quiet. And whenever Moscow's legal strategy goes quiet, it usually means the paperwork is finished and the filing is coming. Early this week, European legal monitoring bodies detected what they described internally as a coordinated domestic court action, including the assertion of jurisdiction over foreign-seized assets that had not been legally contested in over 2 years. This wasn't a random lawsuit. This was the kind of judicial maneuver that Russia only deploys when it is signaling something very specific. Retaliation for sanctions pressure. Deterrence against future asset seizures. Or coercion aimed at freezing Western enforcement. Observers didn't immediately know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was this: Russia was changing its legal posture. And when a state weaponizes its courts, even subtly, international regulators pay attention. Because courts don't just interpret law. They create facts on the ground. Contracts get frozen. Assets get locked. Jurisdiction becomes a battlefield. The response from Western authorities was anything but routine. It was not ceremonial. It was not dismissive. It was urgent. Senior officials, speaking after emergency legal consultations and sanctions coordination calls, described Russia's court move in unusually stark terms. They called it calculated, disruptive, and perhaps most importantly, precedent-setting because it challenged enforcement itself. But sanctions strategy only works if the target complies or at least lacks the tools to resist. This time, Russia had found a tool. And while the West did not hesitate politically, it found itself procedurally constrained. Within hours of the ruling, enforcement agencies paused asset actions. Legal teams issued internal risk advisories. Multinational banks froze compliance decisions. And regulators began reviewing exposure scenarios. These weren't symbolic delays. These were real legal choke points, the kind that only appear when courts, not armies, are in play. Because unlike military responses, legal responses cannot be improvised. They must be argued, filed, appealed. And Russia knew that. This wasn't about winning a case. It was about buying time. And in sanctions warfare, time is leverage. So what exactly did Russia do inside its courts, and why did it matter so much? Because to understand the scale of this move, we need to break it down piece by piece, how the ruling worked, what it targeted, and why it struck at the heart of the West's sanctions machinery. Tonight, European regulatory sources confirmed that Russia's domestic courts had launched a coordinated legal action aimed squarely at the enforcement layer of Western sanctions. The action targeted foreign-seized Russian-linked assets, including corporate equity, escrowed funds, and contractual receivables that had recently been reclassified under emergency sanctions authorities for what analysts believe was pre-seizure liquidation and redistribution. Russia moved before Western authorities could complete that next step. The court filings asserted exclusive domestic jurisdiction over disputes involving Russian nationals and entities, even when the assets themselves sat abroad. They challenged recognition and enforceability. They challenged choice of law clauses. They challenged compliance obligations imposed on foreign banks. And they did so in a way that forced counterparties to stop. In other words, Moscow targeted the legal connective tissue of sanctions enforcement, the component that would have made asset freezes irreversible. This is what made Western warnings so urgent. Because Russia's move wasn't rhetorical, it wasn't political theater, it was procedural. Left unchecked, it could have delayed or derailed asset transfers, exposed institutions to counterclaims, and introduced legal risk severe enough to freeze compliance itself. And Western regulators, understanding that fully, responded not with bravado but with containment. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but cautiously. They didn't rush enforcement. They didn't override due process. They didn't ignore legal exposure. They paused. They reviewed. They isolated the risk. Because in sanctions warfare, a misstep in court can undo years of policy. And here's where the story becomes even more strategic. Multiple legal and intelligence sources now believe Russia's court maneuver was designed to test the cohesion and risk tolerance of Western enforcement systems after months of expanding sanctions regimes and asset seizure proposals. Moscow wanted to see whether regulators would push forward anyway, whether banks would absorb the risk, whether governments would override courts. The expectation inside Russia was not immediate capitulation but hesitation, a pause, a legal review, a delay. And that's exactly what happened. But here's the critical distinction. The West didn't retreat, it recalibrated. Enforcement authorities didn't abandon sanctions. They restructured exposure. They issued quiet guidance. They ring-fenced vulnerable cases. They delayed irreversible actions not out of weakness, but out of prudence. That response was so disciplined, so legally precise, that it changed the nature of the confrontation. You don't get sanctions lawyers' attention easily, but this time, Moscow did. One senior compliance attorney, speaking under anonymity, described the move as jurisdictional jamming, a way to clog enforcement channels without violating sanctions themselves. But Western regulators proved something essential. They remained both legally grounded and strategically adaptive. Their actions were not only cautious, they were targeted, down to jurisdiction, counterparty, and treaty exposure. That precision matters because it reveals intent. It shows regulators are not improvising. It shows governments are not panicking. It shows the sanctions regime is learning under pressure, not collapsing under it. The West is not a passive enforcer. It is an active legal actor, adjusting doctrine, precedent, and procedure in real time. As assessments continued throughout the day, the scale of the impact became clearer and broader than initially understood. Here's what we now know. European financial authorities issued internal advisories, forcing banks to reevaluate exposure, slowing asset transfers already in motion. Multinational compliance teams targeted contracts that had been restructured within the last 6 months, reassessing enforceability under competing court claims. Legal teams operating in London, Brussels, and New York reportedly paused actions tied to Russian claims, anticipating retaliatory filings aimed at freezing counterpart assets. This wasn't just delay, this wasn't just caution, this was systemic friction. This was procedural drag. And procedural drag is the one thing Russia has struggled to generate through economic means alone since early 2022. For every sanctions expansion the West has introduced, Moscow has now countered with something that raises legal cost, extends timelines, and forces reconsideration. The effect compounds. Because when enforcement slows, pressure diffuses. When timelines stretch, leverage shifts. And when uncertainty rises, risk-averse institutions pull back. That doesn't end sanctions, but it reshapes how they function. And that is precisely what Russia intended. So how did we get here? Why did the West assume sanctions law was settled, and why is that assumption now being challenged? To answer that, we have to look backward at the legal history that shaped sanctions policy.